Now, there's a new round in the standoff between Pope Leo and US President Trump. And this time, the Pope appears to be looking to ease tensions. Before we hear from him, a quick recap of how we got here. Earlier this month, Pope Leo repeatedly criticized the US war against Iran and called Donald Trump's threat to annihilate Iranian civilization, quote, truly unacceptable. Trump, of course, hit back, calling the Pope, quote, weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. And he also posted an AI-generated image of himself as a Christ-like figure. Now, today, the Pope spoke again on his plane en route from Cameroon to Angola, and he sounded like a man trying to turn down the temperature. Let's take a quick listen.
There's been a certain narrative that has not been accurate in all of its aspects, but because of the political situation created when on the first day of the trip, the President of the United States made some comments about myself. Much of what has been written since then has been more commentary on commentary, trying to interpret what has been said. Just one little example, the talk that I gave at the prayer meeting for peace a couple days ago was prepared 2 weeks ago, well before the president ever commented on myself and on the message of peace that I am promoting. And yet, as it happens, it was looked at as if I was trying to debate again the president, which is not my interest at all.
Now, let's bring in Colleen Dulle. She's the Vatican correspondent for America Magazine and has followed this standoff between the Pope and Donald Trump from day one. Welcome back, Colleen. Now, how do you read the Pope's statement today? Is he turning the other cheek?
Yeah, it's interesting that it's been framed as kind of an effort to turn the temperature down. Personally, I think that he just feels that the Trump commentary on what he's been doing is a distraction. He said this, in similar terms on Monday when he was asked about the president's comments. And in response, he said, my message is the gospel. I am not a politician. I'm not here to get into a debate with Trump. And that's essentially what he said again today.
And why do you think he chose to say this today?
I think that the clip you just showed gives us a clue in that he talked about that speech that he gave in Cameroon. This is the one where he said that a handful of tyrants are seeking to, grab the world's resources. And as you mentioned, that speech was written weeks ago. This is a very consistent message that the Pope has had. And yet, in the context of this kind of back and forth between the two men, it was seen as kind of the latest barb that the Pope had thrown at Trump. When in reality, the Pope has criticized Trump on the war. The president posted this Truth Social post. The Pope was asked about it. And then the Pope really hasn't said anything more about Trump's comments since then, while Trump and Vance have continued to comment on it throughout the week.
Now, we are going to hear from Vance in a moment, but what does the Pope mean when he says there's been a certain narrative that has not been accurate?
Yeah, I think that's what I just referred to in that... Sorry, I hit my microphone. That everyone has been reading his comments about peace, about economic justice throughout his time in Africa, which he's been taking a trip across Africa all this week. It'll continue into next. They've been taking it as comments about Trump, comments about the United States. And, certainly some of them apply to the United States. It's traditional Vatican protocol for a pope not to name aggressors that they're criticizing so as to keep dialogue open, especially through back channels with those countries. And so to have him actually name Trump within the last couple of weeks has been very unusual. But in his speeches this week, he hasn't been naming aggressors. It's been actually quite pointed that he hasn't, because he gave a speech about breaking the chains of corruption in front of President Paul Biya, who has, reigned since the 80s and is widely seen as a dictator. So the fact that he is going out of his way not to name the people he's criticizing, I think points to the fact that Trump can't safely assume that the Pope's criticisms are about him, nor can the media.
Now, is there someone advising the Pope on these matters? Someone who may have told him, you need to end this fight with Trump?
He's certainly well advised on matters of diplomacy. So the Vatican does have a Secretary of State and an entire Secretariat of State. They have ambassadors in countries around the world representing the Pope, representing the Holy See, and those bishops generally feed back a lot of information. So I would say certainly this Pope also follows English-speaking media himself. He's been traveling with journalists for the last week, so he knows how this is being covered. Whether he was advised specifically to turn this down, I don't know. To me, the message that we got today sounds very much like what Leo says on his own. So I would say that probably he has seen the way that this narrative of the Pope fighting with Trump, dominating his trip to Africa and saying, actually, like, dear journalists on the plane, I want you to focus much less on this.
Now, a few days ago, the Pope said, quote, "I have no fear of Donald Trump." Can you imagine any reason why the Pope should fear Donald Trump?
I'll say the only reason that I can think of, because certainly the United States would not take military action against the Vatican or the Holy See, right? There's no economic sanctions they can put on them. I think maybe, we have seen a cut to Catholic Charities funding in Florida that some have been trying to frame as a direct response to the Pope Trump spat. I don't know if that's necessarily the reason why, but certainly we could see things like that where Trump could, attack the Catholics in the United States that way by withdrawing funding from certain projects. But yeah, I think that, Leo's focus, as he said on Monday, is on preaching the gospel, preaching blessed are the peacemakers. And that's going to upset a president who is, at war right now. But I think that I don't think that there's anything that Trump could do that would distract Leo from that message.
Now, let's talk about how his administration, Trump's administration, views the papacy more broadly. Let's hear a very interesting soundbite here from Vice President J.D. Vance speaking just a few days ago.
I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. I think one of the issues here is that if you're going to opine on matters of theology, you've got to be careful. You've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth. And that's one of the things that I try to do. And it's certainly something I would expect from the clergy, whether they're Catholic or Protestant.
Now, let that sink in for a moment. Isn't that a bit rich? A politician essentially lecturing the Pope to be careful when he talks about theology.
Yeah, yes, it is. I fully agree with you there. Certainly, Pope Leo has significantly more theological background than J.D. Vance. This is not to misread or say that Vance, doesn't have his heart in the right place when it comes to Catholicism. But I think that, Pope Leo has, multiple advanced degrees in theology and canon law. He's worked as a missionary. He's now the leader of the Catholic Church. So it's a little bit bizarre to have J.D. Vance tell him to be careful when talking about theology. I'll also say, this isn't solely a matter of theology. The Pope is a moral leader. He's looked to by many different nations, many different faiths across the world with respect as somebody who preaches what is right and wrong. And so this is not, merely some political statement, political opinion that the Pope is giving.
Now, Vance and Trump, do they believe that when the Pope speaks, he is merely expressing a religious opinion rather than speaking with the authority of God's representative?
Yeah, this is a part where J.D. Vance's personal religious beliefs, I think, could be in conflict with what he's saying publicly. And so I can't speak to exactly what's going on with him there. But we've seen, with many popes in the past where political leaders, especially U.S. presidents, will play down what they say as merely their opinion. They'll tell them to stay in their lane. We saw this whenever Pope Francis started speaking out about the injustices of free market capitalism, or when he spoke out about the environment. And we heard back then from, United States politicians that the Pope should just stick to church matters. But the fact is that the Pope is not merely the governor of the church, right? As I said before, he is a moral authority. He feels a responsibility to speak out for what he sees as the truth.
And briefly, do you think the Pope's message will shift if the Iran war continues?
I don't. The Pope has been against this war from the beginning. He's been against any military escalation, so I expect that we'll see the exact same thing. I can't imagine any universe in which the Pope changes his tune and is suddenly in favor of the war.
Thank you very much. Colleen Dulle, the Vatican correspondent at the America magazine. Thank you.
Thank you.